Welcome to the DiLCo Lecture Series on Digital Language and Communication. So I am Heike Zinsmeister from the University of Hamburg. We had a couple of lecture sessions before this year. For those of you who attend the lecture series for the first time, I'd like to introduce the DiLCo project briefly. DiLCo is a 3-year scientific network on digital language variation in context. Initiated in 2021, and it's coordinated by my colleague Yannis Androtsopoulos, who is also here, but who is traveling today and is joining us from elsewhere in the world. And I'm at the University of Hamburg. The network currently includes scholars from universities in the US, UK, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Denmark. DiLCo is generously supported by the University of Hamburg within the Universities of Excellence scheme, funded by the German federal government and the federal states. Okay. Sorry. Our project, or the network DiLCo, aims to stimulate scientific exchange between various approaches to digital language and communication research within linguistics, and also to bridge the gap between qualitative and quantitative methods. In this purpose, DiLCo is organizing online and on-site activities, such as conference panels. Actually, there will be one next week at the Social Linguistics Symposium in Kent, organized by Yannis, the colloquium Beyond Boundaries in Digital Social Linguistics, synergizing between interactional and computational approaches. It takes place on Thursday in Ghent. And there will be also a method workshop on October 8th, and then this DiLCo lecture series. You can find more information on our webpage. These lectures showcased cutting-edge international research by senior and younger scholars who draw on key concepts in social linguistics, social-cultural linguistics, such as community, context, identity, interaction, multimodality, and also linguistic change to shed light on digital communication. So we are recording these lectures to build up a repository that will be available open access from Hamburg University's video portal. Lecture to go. Please visit our website for more information. As in the past, each lecture is about 40 minutes, followed by discussion. Feel free to post questions and comments into the chat during the lecture. Okay, so this was the general intro. Now I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Caroline Tagg from the Open University, UK. Caroline is a senior lecturer in applied linguistics and editor-in-chief of the international journal Discourse, Context and Media. Caroline is no stranger in research on digital language and communication. Her writings since 2007 include papers in journals such as Journal of Social Linguistics, Language in Society, International Journal of Multilingualism, World Englishes, Pragmatics and Society. I'm not done. Caroline's work also includes an impressive number of authored books and edited volumes, including The Discourse of Text Messaging, which is based on her dissertation, then Language of Social Media, Identity and Community on the Internet, Exploring Digital Communication, Taking Offense on Social Media, Conviviality and Communication on Facebook, and Mobile Messaging and Resourcefulness, a Post-Digital Ethnography, which was just published. Caroline's approach to digital language and communication is a social linguistic, qualitative, and context-sensitive one. She's interested in how digital communication practices are embedded into people's everyday lives and how people use resources from their linguistic repertoires to manage relationships and construct identities and communities online. She's currently working on a British Academy mid-career fellowship project, namely Mobile Conversations in Context. And this is also the subject of her talk today. Thank you, Caroline, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Heike. And thanks very much for the invitation to give a talk in this series. So yes, as you said, what I want to talk about today is my current project, Mobile Conversations in Context, which is funded by a British Academy mid-career fellowship. Not so sure about the mid-career bit, but apart from that, great. So I've been working with my research associate, Penny Manford, and the Open University affiliated researcher, Chi-Min Chua. And our interest in a nutshell is in conversations mediated by mobile messaging apps, so WhatsApp, SMS, Facebook Messenger, and so on. And the two main things that I want to do today are firstly, and this is the overall argument of the project, is to argue that we can't fully understand mobile conversations without looking at them in context. That is, not only taking into account people's relationships, identities, backgrounds, polymedia identities, and so on, but also the parallel activities and encounters in which they're simultaneously engaged while they're messaging. And this is part of what I'm calling a post-digital approach, which I'll talk about later. And secondly, I want to illustrate the additional insights that this can bring by looking at one finding from my data so far. So this is how people use mobile messaging to connect with others, but that they do this in part by taking advantage of the distance afforded by mobile messaging. So I'm going to start by sort of situating my approach within digital language variation research, and then outline my particular project design. And then I'll switch a little bit to talk about virtual connection and distance, and then present some initial analysis. And I should say from the start that this is very much work in progress. So my starting point is the current understanding in digital language research of the situated nature of all online and mobile communication, so that online spaces are grounded in offline contexts and activities, and that communication mediated in particular by the mobile phone facilitates a fluid engagement with both online and offline environments. And this understanding calls for a post-digital perspective. So the post-digital, as I'm using it here, doesn't refer to a time sort of after digital technology, but rather a recognition that the digital is no longer a salient or disruptive element of society, but instead it's an integral part of society. But it's a society that's been transformed by the possibilities for new forms of interaction. So the question facing digital language researchers in a post-digital society is how to take account of the various contexts relevant to a virtual interaction and to incorporate that as part of a linguistic or discourse analysis. And of course, there are many researchers who are already addressing this question in different ways. So a growing number of studies combine digital ethnography with traditional ethnographic techniques, including offline observation. And these offer insights into how people's digital interactions are shaped by their socioeconomic backgrounds, their mobility across spaces, their aspirations, their ideologies. In his study of computer-mediated communication, Rodney Jones takes a mediated discourse analysis approach to explore how people carry out actions across online and offline spaces. And he highlights the importance of attention, so how people distribute their attention across these different spaces as they carry out these social actions. And he shows how timing and rhythm can be an important resource in managing relationships online. And from a conversation analysis perspective, Florence Olof explores how co-present interlocutors initiate and negotiate individual mobile phone use during offline interactions. So showing that the use of one's phone during an offline interaction must be carefully framed, as you can imagine. However, she doesn't look at the mobile conversations themselves to explore how they're shaped by the co-presence, the physical co-presence of others. So my aim is to build on this work and other similar work to explore how the activities and encounters in which people are engaged shape and are shaped by their mobile conversations, and so provide a more holistic analysis of how mobile messaging interactions unfold in the moment. So to do this, the project adopted the following methodology, which might be called a sequential mixed methods approach. So a sort of quantitative element as well as the qualitative element. in the form of a survey. So this was our starting point, which asked respondents about their mobile phone use and their use of messaging apps. I distributed it through my extended social networks. And because of this, or partly because of this, the demographic of the respondents are skewed slightly towards women, and definitely towards people in their mid-30s to mid-50s, so older than in a lot of messaging studies, and also people living in the UK. Most of the respondents are also in either full-time or part-time employment, and many of them have children. This was all elicited from the survey, and a response rate of 170 people. As well as flagging up some of the key themes that then sort of surfaced later in the project, the survey was important in recruiting interviewees. So in the end, 12 respondents took part, and I carried out an initial interview with each of these 12, in which I followed up on the survey and also explained the next stages of the project. The next stage was a diary. So each interviewee completed a diary during a 3-day period of their choice, and I asked all of them to pick 2 weekdays and then a weekend day, 3 consecutive days. So usually Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. And as you can probably just about make out on this tiny picture of it, they were asked to note what they were doing in 15-minute intervals, where they were, who they were with, and where their phone was. And this diary is adapted from time use studies, such as those by Dale Southerton. So these are usually big quantitative studies that aim to look, for example, at how much time men and women spend doing housework, for example, or how that's changed over time. And so I adapted it for quite a different purpose. Participants also sent me all the mobile messages that they had sent and received in that 3-day period. And this was obviously a sort of crucial part of the data collection. So they usually sent them in the form of screenshots like this one. In some cases, participants withheld some messages, usually because a contact hadn't given consent. So in some cases, I don't have all the messages that they sent and received in that period, but I have most of them and sometimes all of them. But that needs to be taken into account when looking at the findings. And then the final stage of the project was a follow-up interview. And as you can just about see here, I prepared for this by inputting the diary and message data just into a Microsoft Access form. So you can just about see the diary entries at the top of the form. And if you click on a particular entry, it shows you the messages that were sent during that time period. So this enabled me, in the first instance, this enabled me and the participant to scroll through the data as sort of co-analysts and discuss it. And if I just show you that on a slightly larger scale, so this is an example of a screenshot that was submitted by one of my participants, Ed. And as you can see here, Ed initiates a conversation with his family on WhatsApp, asking about his daughter's COVID status. And you can see that his son and his wife also join in. And this is at 10:50 in the morning on a Thursday. And if we look at his diary, this isn't much bigger, but it's a little bit bigger. You can see that Ed was in a film studio, a TV studio. He's actually a cameraman. And so he got up early that morning before his family were awake and was filming all morning when his phone has to be off. And this tea break at 10:45 to 11 was the first opportunity he had to get in touch with his family and ask how his daughter was. When I asked him about this, he gave me some more information, sort of filling in, explaining how the tea break had panned out and how he managed to fit the messages in. I'm not going to read through that, but if you want to have a quick look. So this begins to give you a sense of how the messaging interaction unfolded within Ed's day. And you can also see there as a final comment that he also received a couple of messages from a road group, a group of neighbours, to which he didn't respond. So he chose not to respond in that instance to those. Okay, so what I want to do in the rest of the presentation is to go through some initial analysis of the survey and the message data and focus on how users connect by exploiting the distance afforded by WhatsApp. So what I start by doing is just saying a few words about virtual connection and distance. So I'm defining connection quite broadly, following Mackenzie, as shared social ties, affinities or bonds, which can be felt between individuals. So in other words, connection is less about the frequency or the duration of the contact and more about the experience of feeling connected. And these feelings of connection can be quite fleeting, momentary, so liking a stranger's post on Twitter. But my focus with mobile messaging is more on longer term, sustained feelings of togetherness. And my assumption is that each moment of connection between individuals feeds into a wider relationship. So each interaction between people renews, maintains, strengthens, or challenges a longer term relationship. And importantly, most relationships don't just happen through one mode, so they don't just happen through WhatsApp, but are sustained using a variety of modes. The stronger or closer the relationship, the greater the range of modes through which it will be sustained. In our contemporary polymedia environment, that means a range of media, usually alongside face-to-face communication. And different media tend to become associated with different forms of connection. So much has been written about the potential of mobile communication to create forms of virtual co-presence. And this rests on a contrast between focused conversational encounters on the one hand, and these new forms of connected presence on the other. So focused in-depth interactions or conversational encounters are characterized by mutual attentiveness. For example, the kind of encounters you might have face-to-face or in a voice call or on Skype. And then in contrast, mobile messaging lends itself to frequent short check-ins, asynchronous communication, and the sharing of photos and videos, which creates a continuous background awareness of each other, or a connected presence. And the conclusion across this literature is generally that this sense of virtual co-presence increases intimacy and emotional closeness between people who are otherwise geographically distanced. But other researchers point to the importance of distance rather than co-presence in helping people create connection through mobile messaging apps and other forms of online communication. So according to this argument, distance isn't necessarily a problem in a relationship, as it often tends to be sort of assumed, but it can facilitate and transform human connections. So for example, people sometimes report that they get on better with family when they're apart, and that it's easier to share emotional things in text messages rather than face-to-face. Alinejad developed the notion of careful co-presence, and that's to capture the discerning ways in which migrants selected what to tell their families back home in order to maintain their independence. And this is perhaps nicely captured in what Miller calls the Goldilocks effect, so whereby people use social media to keep people close, but not too close. And people can actively harness mobile affordances to keep people at this appropriate distance. The disconnective practices are nuanced strategies that people adopt for limiting and controlling their technology use, while still being able to connect with others. So it doesn't involve throwing your phone away. It does involve exploiting technological affordances, so turning off message notifications, keeping phones on silent, blocking people, letting calls go to voicemail. Naomi Barron calls this the ability to control the volume of mobile communication. So much of the literature I've cited so far is within anthropology or media communications, and it relies primarily on interviews. Not all of it, but some of it, of the stuff on distance in particular. It also tends to focus more on the technology and less on how people's relationships shape their disconnected practices. But what we're interested in is how connection and distance are achieved and negotiated in interaction with others. In my earlier work with Agnieszka Lyons, we were looking at interactions between people in WhatsApp groups, and we found that sharing in these groups could be seen as a way of creating a joint focus for attention. So like putting something on the table for people to look at. And people could choose to respond depending on their availability or their whereabouts or what else they were doing. But there was no obligation to reply. And in this way, people were accommodating their interlocutors' agency and autonomy. So what I want to do in this talk is to show how interaction analysis can shed light on how people manage relationships and interaction, and particularly how they draw on the affordances of distance to do so. Before I get on to the interactional data, I'm just going to say a bit about the survey, which served to sort of contextualize, I suppose, the interactional data, the qualitative data, and flag up some themes. So the main finding emerging from the survey was that people want to connect with others, but to do so on their own terms and in their own time. So on the one hand, the survey pointed to the important role that mobile messaging played in most of the respondents' lives. So most people reported keeping their phone with them, either to hand or on their person. They suggested that they regularly check their phones, either in response to message alerts or every so often during the day. This depended slightly on whether their phone was on silent or not. Obviously, if it was on silent, they wouldn't hear the message alerts. And people reported using multiple messaging apps. So most use WhatsApp and SMS, but there are a range of other apps, Telegram, Instagram, Facebook Messenger, and so on. And the figures here are slightly misleading. So people did use WhatsApp and SMS. 94, 95% of people did use WhatsApp and SMS, but only 30% of people used SMS throughout the day, compared to 70% of people who used WhatsApp throughout the day. So WhatsApp was used more than SMS, you know what I mean? And finally, people overwhelmingly reported that mobile messaging was a positive part of their lives, and 13% said they weren't sure, so only 2% said it was negative. So when explaining why WhatsApp played a positive role in their lives, most people pointed to the ability to connect with friends and family. A number of people stressed that it was easy or convenient to keep in touch. So it's positive as it enables you to contact someone at a time that suits you. Some people made explicit comparisons between messaging and phone calls, saying, for example, that it's not as intrusive as a phone call. And a couple of responses pointed explicitly to the benefits of distance afforded by mobile messaging. So I feel closer to friends by typing to them sometimes. So these responses begin to point to the ways in which respondents claim to exploit the distance afforded by mobile messaging, and thus exercise control over their time and over their relationships. So in fact, on the other hand, many respondents engaged in what Light and Cassidy call disconnective practices. And so these took two forms. The first were technology related. So for example, many respondents claim to usually keep their phone on silent or to put it on silent at particular times and places, for example, at work. A similar number stated that they turn off message notifications, and there was an overlap between those two groups. So about half of the people did both. Yeah, that makes sense. There was an overlap. People also managed their phone use in relation to sort of certain social principles. So they suggested that they prioritize some offline activities, with most people claiming that they would rarely or never message while having lunch with a friend. However, they suggested that their decision about whether to reply immediately was dependent mainly on the message content. So whether it was urgent, whether it was straightforward, and on consideration of the sender, so who the message was from, and to a lesser degree, the parallel activities they were engaged in. And finally, they recognized their contacts agency in deciding when to reply, and stated quite overwhelmingly that they didn't expect instant replies and it was fine if people didn't reply. There was an interesting discrepancy between these last replies. When asked whether they themselves usually replied immediately, people were more likely to flag up the message content or the identity of the sender. So if it's from my children or my mum, I respond immediately. For others, it depends on how urgent it is. But when asked why they thought other people didn't reply to them, the stated assumption was overwhelmingly that their interlocutor was busy. And only a few mentioned that they or the content of their message may have anything to do with it. And I put up this last comment just because I found it quite amusing. So these findings are largely aligned with the current literature into disconnection and confirm that the survey participants do appreciate and take advantage of the distance afforded by mobile messaging. But they also go a bit further and show how social relationships are implicated in this. So how people's disconnected strategies are used to control different relationships in different ways. So what I want to do now is to go on to look at how this is realized in just one of my participants' interactional practices. So to say something about my approach, my interaction analysis is not conversation analysis, but it is inspired by microanalysis of online data approaches, which seek to apply methods developed for exploring spoken conversation to online communication, and also to pinpoint differences between spoken and online exchanges. So of relevance to this analysis is the observation that the turn-taking mechanism of synchronous face-to-face conversation doesn't apply online, and that turns can best be reconceptualized as contributions which may be neither temporally or spatially adjacent. So I take a dialogic approach to the analysis, exploring not only how messages respond to previous messages, but also how they evoke shared communicative histories and how they anticipate subsequent replies. So I draw, for example, on how interactants align with each other through self-positioning and around shared stances, and on how alignment is realized through what Tannen calls involvement strategies, so a range of linguistic and other resources used to signal engagement or interest, which are underpinned by repetition. And I also draw on digital specific ways of doing alignment. So ritual appreciation involves highly conventionalized language, often coupled with emoji, which respond to an act of sharing. And knowing participation involves an interactant drawing on shared knowledge from outside the immediate encounter. And the analysis also takes into account, as best it can, the parallel activities and interactions beyond the encounter being analysed. And so, therefore, it considers the role of timing, of attention, and physical co-presence in shaping interactions. And then the interpretations are supported by the interview data. So what I'll do now in the rest of the presentation is present some initial interaction analysis. And as I said, I've decided just to focus on one participant. And please ask me later why that participant and how typical they are. But for the moment, I'll just focus on this one. And I use it to illustrate how participants connected with important people in their lives, taking advantage of the distance afforded by WhatsApp to control these connections. So this is Hannah. So Hannah keeps her phone on silent. She mainly used WhatsApp as well as SMS for more transactional exchanges. So she used it, for example, messages from her son's school. She was what we're calling a low-level user of WhatsApp. So she sent 23 messages over 3 days and received 27. The couple of participants who received the most messages sent and received sort of 400. So there was quite a range, and Hannah was at the, not the lowest, but almost the lowest level user. Also, she almost never initiated conversations, so she would reply to other people. Two relevant points emerged from the interviews. So firstly, Hannah regards mobile conversations as being trivial. So this is something she came back to repeatedly and was quite dismissive about. So she sees that messaging as a sort of form of light-hearted banter that acts as a kind of time filler. In interviews, she said that if a friend had messaged me and I can see that they're not happy or whatever, I would probably phone them. And indeed, most of the messages that were sent or received during the 3-day period, or the ones she submitted to us anyway, constituted this really light-hearted and humorous chat between friends. And secondly, Hannah had what we're calling a somewhat resigned attitude to the role of the mobile phone in her life. So she accepted it, but she wasn't enthusiastic about it. And she voiced clear ground rules for limiting WhatsApp use. This mainly involved keeping exchanges to a minimum length. She had quite sort of definite ideas about, oh, that conversation is finished, there's no point saying anything else, or there's nothing to say, and she just wouldn't reply. And also managing response rates, so replying when she was sort of ready to. So I'm going to look at 2 extracts from her diary and messages. a longer one on Sunday afternoon, and then a shorter one on the following Monday morning. So in this first extract, I'm focusing on Hannah's exchange with an old university friend, Lucy. And you can see here on the screen Hannah's diary entries, plus her messages, both the sent and received ones. And I want to sort of show two things. One, how connection is built dialogically between Lucy and Hannah. And then secondly, how this connection is shaped by the parallel activities in which Hannah's engaged. So at 12:20, on this Sunday before Christmas, Hannah is making lunch with her son in the kitchen, and Lucy shares a video of her goldfish. So just to give a little bit of background about this, Hannah used to have goldfish. Lucy now has goldfish because her husband bought them without her consent while she was away. And Hannah had been amused by this, and so had asked for the goldfish's names to add them to a Christmas card. And she was also amused by the goldfish's names, and so she asked to see a photo of the fish that was called Jack Grealish. And in Hannah's words, Lucy waits until Jack Grealish is having like the world's biggest fish poo before she sends through a picture. In fact, it's a video of this. So in her response at 12:25, Hannah's beaming face with smiling eyes emoji is a form of ritual appreciation of the video. And her question, who is the big flappy one, shows that she's paying attention to the video, or shows that she's watched the video, in fact. According to Tannen, attention to detail is a sign of intimacy, which serves to convey a meta message of rapport, of caring, because it indicates interest. So when Lucy replies, the parallelism between their turns also signals involvement. This can be seen in the lexical repetition of the big flappy one as the flappy one, in a way that emphasizes what Hannah has got right and what she's got wrong. So Otto is the flappy one, flappy goldfish, and he's also distinguished by his orange tail, but he's not big, he's merely nearer to the camera. So the repetition shows where their positions align and where they don't. Hannah then appears not to look at her phone, or at least not to respond to messages while she has lunch with her son. She told me she found checking messages when eating in company to be quite rude, sort of in line with the survey responses, and she put this down to her age. But while having lunch, she receives two messages from another old friend, Hazel. Both Hazel and Lucy sort of live a distance from Hannah, but they're close old friends. So she would have been aware of these messages because she was alerted by her smartwatch to incoming messages. So she would have had a buzz on her smartwatch, but she doesn't reply. So after lunch, she takes her phone to the lounge by herself, where she does a jigsaw puzzle. Hannah explained that she'd had a COVID booster jab the day before, and so she wasn't feeling very well, and that's why she spent so much time doing a jigsaw puzzle. And I'm just going to focus on three things with this stretch: device attending, shifts in framing, and parallelism again. So once Hannah has moved to the lounge, she messages both Lucy and Hazel, and here she's doing what Agnieszka and I have called device attending. So she's picking up her phone to check her messages, often responding to more than one thread. The fact that she's device attending might explain the parallelism between or you and you. So attention is much on her device and getting out her messages as it is on the individual conversations. And we'll see that she does this again later before going for a walk. The conversation as a whole is characterized by a couple of shifts in framing. So a first shift in framing seems to be prompted by the time gap between this message at 12:50 and Lucy's previous one, which was 12:25. So Hannah steps back from appraising the video and again engages directly with Lucy, sort of on a more personal level about her fish. Well, you've made me want some more fish, who cleans them out? And in fact, that's a contentious issue for both Hannah and Lucy, because their husbands are supposed to be looking after the fish. No. Hannah then again brings it back to the video with a second shift when she says Otto seems a bit of a show-off. So again, she's showing attentiveness and interest, so her focus on the video. And finally, Hannah and Lucy's conversation throughout is characterized by parallelism, both between and within contributions, which suggests their alignment with each other and their attention to wording. So firstly, there's a parallelism between their husbands' names, which clarifies the two men's distinct involvement with the fish. and marks how Hannah and Lucy align around their seemingly shared position, including them out, i.e. they don't want to. Secondly, both Hannah's and Lucy's messages appear to be characterized by what Tannen, in relation to speech, calls patterned rhythm, so a kind of structural parallelism in which a sentence structure rather than lexis is repeated. So Hannah writes, sorry about the subject of this conversation, but Hannah writes, fish poo makes me heave, guinea pig poo, fine. And then Lucy echoes this with, Otto and Splashy are quite fun and happy. Jack Grealish doesn't do a lot except poo emoji. Peppy either sulks or bullies Jack Grealish, with the poo emoji linking it back to the initial video. So this focus on forms suggests that the two are engaging with each other through their language choices, despite the very trivial subject content. This is the final bit of Sunday's extract, and then I've just got Monday's to go through. So in Lucy's message here, your Christmas card really made Millie laugh a lot. Lucy is referring to the Christmas card that Hannah sent both to the family and the goldfish. So again, she's picking up on their shared communicative history. And Hannah responds 13 minutes later when she appears to check her phone before going for a walk. So again, she's device attending, checking her messages between activities. And the question, has he received many cards, links back to Lucy's message and refers to the goldfish. So she's asking if the goldfish has received many cards. So it's dialogically embedded in her ongoing interaction with Lucy. But both that message and try a wooden spoon can be read as somewhat dry, and I'd argue that neither explicitly elicits replies. And this may be because Hannah's about to go for a walk by herself with her phone staying in her pocket. So in interviews, she said, it's like a conscious effort if I go out for a walk, not to engage in any kind of trivial conversations, because I want to enjoy being in the woods rather than being on my phone. And there's seemingly no need to close the conversation or manage their departure from it, so the exchange just drops to be picked up later. So this analysis shows how a sense of connection is built dialogically through attention to each other's contributions and references to their wider communicative history. It also shows how this is facilitated by the fact that both Hannah and Lucy appear to have found themselves with time on their hands on a Sunday afternoon, and it's shaped by the rhythm of the afternoon's activities. So as Hannah moves from lunch to the jigsaw and then out for a walk. And the distance afforded by mobile messaging is crucial here. So it enables Hannah to break off when she's doing something else and to keep their conversation at a light-hearted, trivial level. So Hannah doesn't tell Lucy that she's feeling poorly, for example. So this is the final extract, which is the following morning, between Hannah and the other old university friend of hers, Hazel, who you met briefly in the last extract. So on Monday morning, Hannah receives a message from Hazel at 7:29 while she's still sleeping. Her phone's downstairs in the lounge, that's where she kept it every night, but she would have been aware of the message once she was awake because of her smartwatch. When I asked Hannah why she didn't reply to Hazel until an hour later, so after feeding the guinea pigs, after having breakfast, Hannah said, sometimes if you reply immediately, you get into a long chat, whereas sometimes it's better that people think you're not available immediately. I was surprisingly busy, so I didn't want to be too distracted. So there are perhaps two observations I'll make here. Firstly, that her interaction with Hazel is shaped by the parallel activities in which she's engaged. So she's getting ready for a particularly busy work day on which she wants to focus, and she messages Hazel just before settling down to work. As a lot of the participants did actually, quite often messaged after they sat down to do some work. But anyway, secondly, she deliberately delays a response as a tactic to avoid initiating a conversation, or in other words, to avoid creating a sense of co-presence. And so in doing so, she's using timing as a resource to control the interaction. And the reason that she feels she can do this in an unproblematic way is predicated in part on Hazel sharing that understanding, the understanding that an immediate reply is not needed. Hannah said, you kind of get to know people, don't you? Like Hazel, we do WhatsApp fairly regularly, but I wouldn't expect her to respond immediately, and she wouldn't expect me to respond immediately. And she went on to say that she had another friend who got a bit twitchy if she didn't reply immediately. Okay, so my final point, looking at the message Hazel sent, we might argue that she didn't anticipate a quick reply. So it's not styled as a turn in a conversation, but it's a contribution that's more akin to a short letter or an email. So it's relatively long, it's got paragraphs. It starts with a greeting, an acknowledgement of their last meeting, an apology, and then sort of an announcement and a sign off. And if we look at Hannah's response at 8:31, we can see that her linguistic choices are designed to engage or connect with Hazel. So firstly, she uses repetition, as we saw before in her interaction with Lucy. So interestingly, the letter flooding in Hannah's ooh echoes Hazel's own vowel repetition in you. It was lovely to see you is a reformulation of Hazel's lovely to see you last night. And the two kisses at the end of her message also parallel Hazel's and might also be seen as closing the exchange, as in Hazel's case as well. I think they're both sort of signaling that the exchange is sort of momentarily at least closed. Another participant told me that a kiss in a message is like a full stop, but a pretty one. And Androutsopoulos and Bush have written about the role of full stops in signaling finality in messaging. And finally, Hannah refers explicitly to their shared communicative history, specifically to their discussion last night of Hazel wanting to make a trip back to their hometown, Rochdale. So by paying close attention to Hazel's wording and their previous conversation, Hannah's showing that she's aligning with Hazel. She's trying to make a connection. So here we see again how mobile messaging is used by this participant as a way to connect and show their alignment through their linguistic choices. But on the busy Monday morning, Hannah's less inclined to maintain this side channel of light-hearted banter, as she had done the day before with Lucy. So she therefore exploits the affordances of mobile messaging to avoid creating a sense of temporal co-presence and connects with her friends in a way that fits around her other activities and maintains an appropriate distance. So to conclude, what I've tried to show with that slightly odd example perhaps, is how looking at mobile messaging in context can add additional nuance and insight to an interactional analysis. So in this case, I focused on how people use mobile messaging to control their interactions with others. So as reported in other studies, we saw how survey respondents drew on a range of disconnected strategies or reported doing so, such as keeping their phones on silent. And we also saw how they prioritized certain messages and certain senders, and that they appreciated the fact that mobile messaging enabled them to reply in their own time. But the interactional data enabled us to go further than that, to see how connection and control are realized in the course of unfolding interactions. So for example, we saw how Hannah engaged in a range of involvement strategies to signal her connection with her friends, while deliberately delaying sending a message in order to avoid creating a sense of co-presence and actually talking to them. The how and why she did this was facilitated by her relationships with her interlocutors and their shared polymedia ideologies as they relate to WhatsApp. But it was also deeply embedded in her immediate shifting context. So on Sunday, she's looking for a distraction while she's doing the jigsaw, and on Monday, her attention is focused on the working day ahead. So she thus drops in and out of mobile conversations depending on what she's doing and where the focus of her attention lies. And as a final point, in relation to the exploitation of distance, my argument here is not that this is unique to mobile messaging, quite the opposite. So I'd suggest that all human relationships involve a balance or a tension between connection and control. So connecting with others whilst also maintaining an appropriate social distance to protect one's privacy or limit what's shared and control access to oneself. And that this is realized across all the modes of interaction through which a relationship plays out. But the particular affordances and conditions of mobile messaging perhaps bring this tension to the fore. So mobile messaging has the potential both for great intimacy and for keeping people at arm's length. And new communicative strategies and norms are needed to keep people at that appropriate distance. So in this case, close, but not so close that it interrupts what you're doing. And I'll just leave you with the references. I'll just whip through these and you'll have to come back to the recorded version if you want to actually read them. And thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Caroline. I will switch to the gallery.
Yeah.
And the floor is, you were perfect in time. I'm very impressed.
Yeah, so am I. So am I.
The time perfectly. But the floor is open for questions. Katharina König.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you so much for this really fascinating data. I think it must be really challenging to, you know, get a grasp of what's actually going on in those people's lives. But you presented that perfectly. And it actually very much reminded me of my research with WhatsApp voice messaging. Because they also, I'd say, somewhat entail this dimension of distance. People usually ask me, like, why don't they use the phone, you know, to call each other? Why do they use this very long voice messages? And I guess distance and, you know, having some control over contacts is something that's involved in that too. So I was wondering, because you have you say that you work with screenshots, basically. So you have a focus on visual data, textual data. Would you say that the visual, text, images, and so on, and the oral or the audible, that they actually constitute something like a continuum of closeness or distance? So how does the semiotic quality actually come into this idea of closeness and distance?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a really interesting observation. I actually only had one participant who used voice messages. A lot of my participants sort of told me they didn't use them, and there were none in the data, except one who possibly coincidentally was the youngest of my interviewees. So she was 35, and she used a lot of voice messages. So she moved between both voice messages and text messages. And I've not sort of sat down and actually analysed her messages yet. But I must admit, listening to your talk, Katharina, about voice messages, I was struck by the possible parallels with my participants, certainly in terms of, just trying to remember now, sort of more complex stories and things like that. She would switch to voice messages. Your actual question as to whether that sort of, how that aligns with the distance sort of intimacy question, certainly to some extent, I think, because messages that were responses to colleagues, yeah, I think sort of things that were more transactional and with colleagues and things would be more likely to be written down as a text message, and the voice messages tended to be sort of chatty stories. That's a fairly sort of blunt response to your question, but I think there's definitely something in that I would like to look at.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Julia, Gillian?
Yes, hello. Yeah, thanks very much, Caroline. That was absolutely brilliant. So there's so much there for me to think about. But I'd like to start with what I got thinking about at the very beginning, really, which was the post-digital. I mean, I thought your explanation was really superb about your use of the term, kind of indicating a change in the, I would say, a wave in what we do as researchers, perhaps in some ways. So yeah, the digital, and also to mark the fact that the kind of disruptive nature, if you like, the dualism is no longer so evident in society. But I'd like to ask you two questions, really. One is that, you know, wasn't it always true that the digital was experienced, you know, by people, you know, that in some ways the kind of previous dichotomy was the product of attention on a new phenomenon rather than what was actually going on? And secondly, do we actually need a better term than post-digital? I mean, every time I use post-humanist, I sort of wrestle with it because I always have to say, I don't mean after, you know, and so is you know, are you thinking of another term, or are you happy with post-digital?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. Yeah, I must admit, to some extent, I probably shouldn't admit this, but I must admit I put it into the title and I thought, oh, now I need to actually use it and deal with it. But it is a term that I used, that Agnieszka Lyons and I used in our latest book that Heike mentioned. So I suppose your answer to your second question, I suppose I don't really have an answer to that. I'm not particularly thinking of another term, but I think you make a really good point. If it's a term where you have to sort of explain it each time you use it and point out what it doesn't mean and things, maybe there's room for something else there. In terms of whether it's always the way, on the one hand, I think you're probably right. And actually, I was thinking about starting this talk looking at sort of the different waves of digital language research, from sort of screen-based textual analysis through to sort of bringing in interviews, becoming more ethnographic, and then sort of breaking down that boundaries. And so I think you're probably right. This is much to do with the gaze of the researcher as much as anything else. One thing that I was struck with the data, and I was wondering, oh, is this really post-digital, is that one of my interviewees, we decided it felt to us like she wasn't really interested in talking about mobile messaging. She was very interested in the relationships, and she used messaging a lot, but it wasn't something she wanted to discuss. It was something that it felt to us was completely transparent. She didn't really have anything to say about mobile messaging. It was quite hard to get her to say anything. But almost all the others, messaging was this slightly salient thing, actually. So I'm undoing everything I've said. But so with people like Hannah and others, it was something they were aware of, that they didn't want to use too much. They wanted to put boundaries around it. They felt it took up time. One participant who saw it as being sort of part of new digital culture and was quite excited about its opportunities for sort of sharing stuff. So in different ways, it kind of was still a salient thing, which made me sort of, I mean, that was an interview, I suppose. But to some extent in their practices, they also did limit their use, it seemed, and have this sort of control, as though it was something that they were very aware of. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks very much. Perhaps
okay.
partly a generational thing then about the participants. But anyway, thank you very much for that answer.
Yeah, it could well have been, yes, yeah.
Dennis?
Yes, thank you, Caroline. I'll try to keep it very short because I'm at a public place that closes down in like 5 minutes. One of the main points in DiLCo in the network is a dialogue between quantitative and qualitative, computational and interactional methods. And for me, this translates into an interest of understanding scalability and in working with data. So from a qualitative perspective, which is yours and also mine, we do qualitative research and identify patterns of communication, patterns in usage. And some of these patterns might lend themselves to be upscaled methodologically. So you can write an algorithm that identifies more of these patterns in larger sets of data. If that makes sense to you, what I would like to ask is, have you identified any such patterns that would be scalable to computational analysis? For what I've seen, I think that your patterns of repetition, so the engagement techniques of taking up wordings, etc., this is something that you could train an algorithm to identify it in data. Do you know what I mean? Is that something you could say something about?
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you for that question. I think it's an interesting point. I mean, well, I suppose my only answer to your specific question is probably yes. That sounds like something to look into. I suppose I'm unsure at the moment as to it. Well, I suppose it's something I'd have to look into as to how those patterns could be sort of scaled up. What I had been doing, which is perhaps not as sophisticated as involving sort of algorithmic calculations, was to identify sort of wider patterns in the data around attention. So I was interested in the way that participants, well, firstly, I suppose that participants sometimes were very focused on the messages. So there's a couple of occasions where people aren't doing anything else. they are just messaging. But then most of the time they're doing other things. So there are sometimes when they're focused on a real world task and they message in order to complete that real world task. There are other times when they're taking photos of what they're doing and sharing that. So they're sort of focused on the real world. So their attention sort of shifts. And I had been starting to try to sort of identify, categorize the messages in terms of those features and to do that a little bit quantitatively. Yeah, my instinct is always to be qualitative. So I do these things and I'm not sure what they tell you sort of about the data, but my intention is to do that, is to try and to at least look at patterns across the data set that I have, if not go beyond that. That possibly half answers your question.
Thank you for this.
Okay.
Thank you. Then Christian Ilbury.
Yeah, thank you very much for that talk. It's really interesting. I just wondered, so this might not apply to the example that you showed us because it shouldn't seem particularly connected, but I wondered if you had a sense of how your participants, and I know you're looking at WhatsApp and SMS, but how they navigate kind of like polymedia environments. So if they are messaging the same person, but on like Instagram or Snapchat or some other platform at the same time, and whether you've been able to consider how they kind of navigate across those spaces. I'm just thinking of, you know, the conversations I've had today with one person have been over like 4 or 5 platforms as opposed to just one single platform.
Yeah, no, thank you. That I was looking at, so I did come into this with an interest in polymedia, but I was at the same time only looking at sort of anything that was messaging. So I do include things like Instagram messaging function. So it is a bit wider than just WhatsApp and SMS. Possibly because of their, I mean, I do wonder to some extent whether the age of the participants makes this project more manageable because they are perhaps using a more limited number of platforms and limited number of contacts maybe than younger people. But there were people who used sort of multiple platforms. So one woman, the woman who used voice messages, in fact, also used Telegram. And she had a group on Telegram, which she had deliberately started up because her family felt that it was more secure than, no, well, not so much, not that it was more secure, but they, as a sort of resistance against Mark Zuckerberg, they'd moved to Telegram. But they had other family groups that they all belonged to on WhatsApp. And so there they were moving between the two. And then somebody else who did use Instagram and had conversations with his brother and a friend, conversations with his brother that moved between Instagram and Facebook Messenger. And he couldn't really, he couldn't explain why that was particularly. He sort of agreed with me that if it was about something that had happened on Instagram, they would chat on Instagram. So often it was initiated by a shared story or something. So yes, what was I going to say in sort of conclusion? I think that is very interesting, and I think that about my own use as well. Sort of how you make those decisions, not only which platform, but then sort of which group, because I guess we all belong to groups with similar people in them, and so that's definitely something that we'll try and look at.
That's cool. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
May I just put myself on the list? I was just wondering, so you collected the actual data and then the interview data. Did you compare the self-description of the people, like Hannah, who said, yeah, she wants to kind of put people at a distance, and as then, but somebody else said, okay, if it's their children or mom, then they would respond immediately. Did you check whether they actually act like they described in the interviews?
Yeah, that's a good question. Generally speaking, I did. So So me and my research associate have been going through the interviews and analysing them thematically, and then producing a sort of participant profile. And then I've been going through the message data and sort of adding to that profile. So in the process, we've been sort of comparing and contrasting what they say in the interviews and what they actually do in the messages. And that's been quite interesting because they've, generally speaking, there have been no sort of contradictions in the sense of they say they don't care about people replying to them, and then you see them madly following up with someone trying to get a reply. But there have been some interesting differences. So the man I referred to earlier, who's on Instagram, Gabriel, told me quite length about how digital culture meant that you didn't. Also, maybe he was an example with that contradiction. He told me at length about how digital culture meant that you just threw memes out there and you didn't have to reply, and that was fine. And yet his messages, although he did do that, he also has these long, involved conversations, and he does actually reply a lot. And the conversations are all about the real world. They're discussing politics and things like that, which is sort of an interesting dimension between how he wanted to come across. But actually, I think partly perhaps because he lived alone, so he wanted to use WhatsApp to sort of reach out. Your specific question about whether, whether they responded to particular people. I can't think off the top of my head, because obviously the interviewees all completed the survey, but I can't recall off the top of my head whether they said anything sort of specific like that I could follow up on. But generally speaking, we were sort of checking that. And it was interesting. It was quite useful, I think, to sort of match how they presented themselves, and then that explained to some extent how they messaged each other. But also sometimes there were these interesting sort of contradictions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So time is up. Thank you again for the very interesting talk. And I'd like to, for those who came late, next week in the Social Linguistics Symposium in Ghent, there will be a panel organized by Yannis Androtsopoulos. Just like to invite you to join this colloquium, and then we will see in September there will be the next talk by Christian Ilbery on September the 22nd, and I'd like to invite you to visit our webpage, the DiLCo webpage, and bye-bye. See you next time, or see you next week in Ghent.